I am pleased to now introduce our next individual who is going to be moderating for us our plenary session on urban migration and global challenges and strategies for the design of healthy communities. And it is Susan Densner. She is the editor-in-chief of Health Affairs, the nation's leading peer-reviewed journal focused on the intersection of health, healthcare, and health policy in the United States and internationally. She is well regarded in the health community as well as a health journalist. She's on air on PBS, on NewsHour, and also a commentator. She has worked and made multiple appearances on CNN and is a regular analyst there as well. She is the chair of the board of directors of the Global Health Council and is a member of the board of overseers of the International Rescue Committee. She is a graduate of Dartmouth and a holder of an honorary Master's of Arts from that institution. She is the Dartmouth trustee immersed and chaired the Dartmouth Board of Trustees from 2001 to 2004, and she currently serves on the Board of Overseers of Dartmouth Medical School. So with that, please welcome Susan Densner.
Good morning, and thank you very much. It's actually denser. I say some people are dense, others are denser. I'm one of the latter category, and I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. We're going to shift gears a bit, but not too much, from Dr. Pin's excellent talk, because the very women she was talking about who need to be involved in clinical trials, who need to be engaged in advancing biomedical education, are women who are going to start off in some of the categories that we're going to be talking about today. They are women who are forced, for whatever reasons, along with their families, from their homes, forced to migrate to urban areas, forced to migrate to camps that become cities unto themselves, forced to bring with them their children, their families, live in very difficult circumstances that challenge their economic well-being, challenge or even block their ability to become educated, affect all of the underlying social determinants of their health, and then, of course, on top of that, expose them to many, many other travails, not the least of them being very difficult situations in which to have pregnancies or bring children into this world. We know that there are about 42 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, and that about half of them are women. 44% of the refugees in the world, refugees are people who move across borders. Internally displaced people are the equivalent of refugees. They just don't move across borders. If you look at just the portion of that who are refugees who've moved across borders, about 44% of them are actually children below age 18. So we understand that these are very much issues that affect women and children. About half of the world's refugees reside in urban areas, and about a third of them reside in camps. But it's increasingly the norm that if you are the victim of forced migration, you're going to end up in a city. So think about the Iraqi mothers now living in Amman because they cannot remain in very violent areas of Iraq, not able to work by Jordanian law, able to send their children to school, but only able to have some family income if the children are sent out to work, or if the daughter is allowed to, quote unquote, marry a foreign Arab diplomat so that he can spend some time with her at his convenience when he happens to be in Amman. These are the kinds of situations those women face. Urban migration as a result of conflict or natural disaster results in extraordinary health risks for women, as we will hear shortly. And although economic migration is often characterized by men moving their families to find work, crisis-induced migration is more often than not the fate of women and children. The health risks for these women and children are pronounced. As we'll hear today, they experience not only reduced access to food and clean water and health services, they experience increased risk of violence. They may need to resort to transactional sex for food, shelter, protection, and so on. And then finally, we know that there is the issue of asylees and trafficking. In the U.S. fiscal year 2010, which will end September 30th, more than 40,000 women and almost 8,000 unaccompanied children are going to be detained here in the United States. Between 26 and 32% of female immigrant detainees are desperately trying to seek asylum here in the U.S. and may or not receive it. Then, as I mentioned, the problem of trafficking. Trafficking, as we'll hear, involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, etc., for the purposes of exploitation. According to the U.S. State Department, an estimated 800,000 people are trafficked across international borders each year. 2 to 4 million people trafficked within countries. And in the last 30 years, the United Nations estimates women and children being trafficked for sexual exploitation in Asia alone has victimized more than 30 million people. So these are all of the subjects we're going to be discussing today, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce the three panelists who will be joining me up here to talk about them. First of all, we're delighted to welcome Susan Purdon, who's the Deputy Health Director of the International Rescue Committee, where I also am an overseer. In this position, she oversees projects addressing the health needs of persons affected by armed conflict in more than 20 countries around the world. She's also an adjunct faculty member at Columbia University's program on forced migration and health. Susan's entire career has focused on public health in the international arena. She's recognized as an expert in the provision of humanitarian assistance. She led the development of the so-called SPHERE standards for humanitarian assistance. And in 1999, she received an award from the Global Health Council for best practice in the field of global health. Susan herself has worked in 34 countries around the world, including the United States. And if I read the first 10 of them to you, you would understand that she's usually in some of the most troubled places in the world. She's been in Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Azerbaijan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Cote d'Ivoire, Croatia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, plus about 24 others. My favorite story of Susan is hearing about how Susan sat down one day with a bunch of Afghan warlords to talk to them about the advisability of them having a maternity center so that their women did not have to suffer a death in childbirth. Perhaps she'll be able to tell us about that. Also very delighted to have with us Emily Butera, who serves as Program Officer for the Detention and Asylum Program at the Women's Refugee Commission, where she advocates for the protection of women, children, and families who seek asylum in the U.S. Before she joined the Women's Refugee Commission, she worked for Catholic Legal Immigration Network, where she conducted research and program development around citizenship and immigration integration initiatives. She also served as a policy advocate at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. She authored a report in 2007 on family detention called Locking Up Family Values, and also a report on unaccompanied alien children called Halfway Home. She's developed and managed youth, legal, and welfare to work programs for immigrants and refugees, and also designed and led coexistence programming for a program called Seeds of Peace. And we're delighted to have Emily with us as well. And then finally, on the subject of trafficking, we will hear from Susan Martin, who holds a chair in international migration and serves as the director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Previously, she was executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which was established by law to advise the Congress and the President on U.S. immigration and refugee policy. Her recent publications include Women, Migration, and Conflict, Breaking a Deadly Cycle, Mexico-U.S. Migration Management, a Binational Approach. She holds an MA and a PhD in History of American Civilization from the University of Pennsylvania, so this is a homecoming for her today. She's also past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration and serves on the U.S. Comptroller General's Advisory Board and also the advisory board, the academic advisory board of the International Organization for Migration. So may I ask my three panelists to come up and join me, and we'll begin our discussion today. Thank you very much.
I'm Susan Purdon, one of the three Susans on the panel, and we have an Emily too. And I'm delighted to be here and want to thank the organizers for inviting us and bringing this topic to your attention. It's part of the issue of women and health around the world, and a significant one with statistics that we've all heard and can see again, but there's a handout on your table with these points about the issue of refugees or urban forced migrants. I work at the International Rescue Committee, which was founded in 1933 at the behest of Albert Einstein to rescue persecuted people from Nazi-occupied Germany. We continue to work in supporting people who are resettling into the United States, and we also work in 25 countries around the world providing health services and other services, social services such as education programming, economic development programs, and civil society development to try to mitigate the effects of conflict on people's lives. My assignment today is to talk about a background on the subject of forced migrants and urban settings and health and women, and I thought I'd start just by trying to put a little clarity in the terminology, because we talk about all sorts of things, and there is a discipline within international health called humanitarian relief, by those of us who do it. It's crisis response, but there are definitions of crises, natural disasters, man-made disasters, which tend to be wars, complex emergencies, conflict, war, all of these various topics of a crisis event. The folks who are affected by these crises include displaced persons or refugees or migrants or forced migrants or economic migrants or people living in camp or non-camp settings or urban or rural settings. And you get the picture. It's complex. There are folks who do work called humanitarian relief, which is the immediate crisis response, but there's a transition from the crisis response into development work, and there are protracted crises like Eastern Congo. There's a period called early recovery. There's long-term post-conflict work. And this graphic comes from the UN Development Program that tries to illustrate that there are strands running throughout society that sometimes explode into a crisis. And the crisis can be in a less developed country or in a middle-income country, or refugees can be living in very poor settings or relatively wealthy cities, as we've already seen. So if we talk about crisis-induced displacement, there is an event that occurs within a population that forces people to leave. Either life becomes unbearable, they're risking threat, their homes are destroyed, whatever, they leave. And they may move to a location within their national borders, and those are called internally displaced persons, or they may cross an international border, and those folks are known as refugees. And these are legal definitions and have implications for people in what services they can access. In those processes of leaving that crisis setting, they'll interact with folks that may help them or may put them at greater risk. So armed groups, traders in the Traders sense of the word, peacekeepers, sex workers, there are a range of folks who can interact with people and can either make their life better or worse. The folks who are internally displaced will be living with some members of their community or their country, residents of their country who haven't been displaced. So those around them are called the host community. Refugees are living with folks who haven't been displaced but in a different country. And there's interaction between those groups. So if we look at risk of health problems, for example, HIV, you would expect that there would be a higher risk for people who are from a lower prevalence setting moving into a higher prevalence setting. And there have been misconceptions in places where HIV is a problem that refugees bring HIV, and in fact, we can see that it works both ways. Sometimes refugees are exposed to HIV when they enter a new location. This photo is from 1994, and it's from a Pulitzer Prize-winning photo journal, photo essay in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette here in Pennsylvania. So what happened in 1994? Rwanda. About 1 million people moved. That creates a city. If you have a new population of 1 million people in one location, people displaced from their own communities, lost family members, lost a sense of community, have a terrible fear of the consequences or the reality that they have experienced. The attention to reproductive health for refugees happened to begin to percolate in 1994. And it was because women from Rwanda attended the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in September of that year. And those refugee women from Rwanda stood up in front of that global audience and said, we used to have access to family planning services when we were living in Rwanda. Now we're refugees, and suddenly we don't have access anymore. So the whole world began to recognize that the issue of women's health of refugees or displaced persons or conflict-affected persons needed attention. Because the traditional relief work was food, water, shelter, and curative health care. But attention to women's reproductive health care, that wasn't on the agenda. I recently co-authored a chapter on a book on maternal and child health with the overview of the impact of war on the health of mothers and children. And you can see that there are multiple contributing factors, but every one of those green splashes is an opportunity to intervene and to help improve things for people. So there, as someone said, I think on the first day of this meeting, we know what to do. What we need to do is make it happen for the people that need the services. Our meeting is about life in the city, and if we look at refugees, we often think about rural areas, very poor countries, and refugee camps. And as we said already, that refugee camps are cities themselves. But in Kenya alone, there are about 400,000 refugees, and about 100,000 of them live in Nairobi. And it's not officially allowed for them to live in Nairobi. They're supposed to live in camps, so it's very difficult for them to access services if they're in the city. And Susan mentioned in the introduction about Iraqis displaced into Jordan and other nearby countries, and the issues for them are profound about access to services. Most countries allow their residents, their citizens, to have access to health care in some social safety net, but it's not often extended to refugees. Although earlier today I heard a wonderful presentation from South Africa about attention to refugees and asylum seekers and access to services. But it was interesting to me to hear that Iraqi refugees who were trying to get access to care, the issue was brought to the government, and the government of, I think it was Syria in this case, said, oh, pregnant women, yes, they should get care. But the women, so if you were pregnant, you could get care, but you couldn't get family planning. So, you know, that doesn't work that way. And as we mentioned, refugee camps look like cities when you have 100,000, 200,000 people there. And Susan mentioned the Afghan warlord story. So I have to brag that we were able to establish birthing centers, and for the Afghan refugees that we were serving living in Pakistan, between 1996 and 2006, we moved from 4% facility-based deliveries to 67% facility-based deliveries. So it can be done. Thanks. Not me, it's them. We have the health coordinator was himself an Afghan refugee doctor. And so he would come to meetings like this and get ideas and take them back and communicate them to the guys that he hung out with, and they got it to work. But it took 10 years, so there aren't quick fixes. It takes time. We've talked about the disadvantages of women in urban settings, and UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has pointed out that refugees in urban settings have even worse situations than the other low-income city dwellers because of their foreignness, if you will. So the concerns for the urban poor extend and even more greatly to refugees in urban settings. And I want to close because time is limited, and I'm going to take the liberty of having your attention to say the answer to changing the world is keeping adolescent girls in school. Now, how do you get from that to health of women? And you can make the leap. But there's a plenary session after this afternoon about keeping girls in school, and I think that's where we need to go. And we need collective action, and we need to all be what I try to teach my students, reflective practitioners. So you think before you act, and then you reflect. And my reflection on 30 years in the business is that, yes, maternal health and emergency obstetric care is essential, but if we're going to change the world, we have to keep adolescent girls in school. Thanks.
Well, good morning. I am the non-Susan on the panel. Again, my name is Emily Butera, and I'm with the Women's Refugee Commission. And the Women's Refugee Commission is a research and advocacy organization that is dedicated to focusing on the needs of women, children, and youth in refugee and IDP situations and asylum seekers here in the United States, and developing recommendations that stem in part from the women and children's own needs and experiences and recommendations, and to elevate them to the level of systemic reform and policy change. And given what you've just heard from Susan, you may wonder a little bit what I'm doing here at a conference that's focused on urban planning, talking about the needs of individuals who are locked in a detention facility in a rural area in the United States. But there are 2 points that I want to make, because I assure you that there are connections that exist here. And the first is that detention is an increasing threat for refugee populations, and particularly for urban refugee populations. Folks who live in closed camps, like you heard Susan talk about, may be apprehended and detained for violating sort of the terms of their presence in a country, for leaving the camp. They may be identified because they are working without identification or without work authorization. And as the rest of the world is looking more and more to detaining, they're looking to the United States for the model on how to do detention, and really for the model on how to use detention as a deterrent to future migration flows. So I want to take the few moments that I have here to just tell you a little bit about the detention system in the U.S. You heard the general statistic, about 400,000 adults will be detained in the United States this year. They're held in about 270 facilities. They're located all across the country. Pennsylvania, interestingly, is a bit of a hot zone for immigration detention. About an hour west of here, there is the only facility in the country that detains parents with their children. That's in Berks County. And if you go another hour southwest, you get to York. And York is the largest immigration detention facility in the Northeast. And who is in detention? Well, it's men, it's women, it's children. Interestingly, we are one of the only Western, Northern, whatever term you want to use, countries who detain children. And there are also numbers of families. Detention population includes asylum seekers. It includes victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, pregnant women, nursing mothers, individuals with mental illness. And the use of detention has really, really expanded in the United States in recent years. In 1996, a law was passed that really expanded the categories of people who are subject to detention. So under that law now, anybody who shows up at a United States port of entry, so they land at the Philadelphia airport and says, I'm afraid to go home, I want to apply for political asylum, is subject to mandatory detention under the law. So what does it look like if you are in detention? Well, detention looks like a jail because it is a jail. Most detainees are actually held in state and local jails that contract bed space to the federal government. They're in jumpsuits. They are commingled with the criminal population. They get maybe an hour of recreation a day. Often that's on a basketball court that's closed except for some screens around the roof. That's their fresh air. They have almost no freedom of movement. They have very limited access to phones, to attorneys. They have no right to government-paid counsel. And they're frequently transferred to facilities across the country. So they're moved away from their attorneys and they're moved away from their families and their support structure. There are standards of care that apply to immigration detention, but those are based on the American Correctional Association standards of care. And interestingly, nobody who's in immigration detention is in custody on a criminal charge. These are administrative detainees, so I would argue that the standards ought to be much, much different. And these standards, such as they are not enforceable, and any monitoring that is done by Department of Homeland Security of itself and of its contractors. So there are really no checks and balances on this system. There are an awful lot of problems, and I'm going to focus on the medical and mental health care since our time is limited. And we know that the care is perilously flawed. We know that there have been 107 deaths since 2003. Those are actually a little bit higher. There's been a few in a couple of months, and the last one was actually here in Pennsylvania. And we also know that ICE does not report, ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the agency of the federal government responsible for detention. They don't report all of these deaths. They have criticized themselves in reports that have been released. They know that this is a problem. And the biggest problem is delay and denial of services. Detainees don't know how to access services. If they lived in the community and they had private health insurance, they cannot avail themselves of those insurance benefits from detention. If they're sick, if they have a headache, they put in a request. They may wait 24 hours. They may wait 3 weeks to see a doctor. There are very few translators available, and if you don't happen to speak Spanish, you're probably out of luck. This is a real problem, especially for asylum seekers. And there's really not a lot of cultural sensitivity. We hear a lot of women who are victims of sexual assault, other forms of gender-based violence, who are examined by a nurse who has no training in identifying those issues. They may have a male translator. They may be in a room that's just separated from the larger clinic with a curtain. And they have, they're just not comfortable explaining what happened to them in order to access care and in order to win an asylum claim. And a lot of the women that we talk to as we go around the country overseeing, monitoring what's going on at these facilities is that they say, I'm afraid to ask for care because if I ask for care, I'm afraid that I'm going to be put in isolation. I'm afraid that it's going to have an adverse impact on my legal case. And in fact, that is sometimes the case. There was a big series that the Washington Post ran a couple of years ago on medical care and detention. And if you saw that series, one of the things that really jumped out is that there is a tendency towards misdiagnosis, particularly of people with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, as having psychosis. And of course, with the high rate of trauma in asylum-seeking communities, depression and PTSD are very, very common. But what they are doing is they are either mismedicating these people with very, very heavy antipsychotic drugs, or for people with mental illness, they're either placing them into isolation, sometimes for weeks and months, or they're sedating them with drugs that are not indicated for treatment of the health condition that they are demonstrating. And we have heard cases of detainees falling out of top bunks because they've been so sedated, waking up at the hospital wondering how they got there. There's no continuity of care when people are transferred. Their files and their medications don't usually transfer with them. There's very little discharge planning. If they are deported, they're supposed to have 2 weeks of medication. We know of people who've been transported, deported in comas, people who are in wheelchairs, who are wheeled onto the plane and then removed from the plane with no wheelchair, no services waiting for them in the country that they are being removed to. Some of the ways that these problems of the system play out for women in particular, I already mentioned problems related to care for gender-based violence victims. There is very little prenatal care. We talked to women who were pregnant who did not receive any prenatal care during the time that they were detained. Often what happens is that ICE releases women in the 8th month of pregnancy because they don't want to deal with the cost of labor and delivery. When women do get care, they're shackled when they're transported to an outside medical clinic. And we also have heard a number of cases of women who are shackled during labor and delivery. Not necessarily practices that are unknown in the correctional system, but remember that this is not actually a correctional model. I just wanted to share a couple of words about why the system is so flawed, because I think the blame is sometimes unfairly placed on the doctors and the nurses and the psychiatrists who are in the facility. There are certainly doctors and nurses who are not providing the level of care that they ought to, but I really think that they're stuck in a problematic system. The system was designed for a really small, revolving door kind of population, quick in, quick deport. But when they changed the law and they started detaining asylum seekers and they started detaining people with green cards, they have a population that's staying in detention much, much longer. And they also have a population of people who have more chronic health needs prior to admission into a facility. There's also a really high vacancy rate. The vacancy rate is about 18%. They have a lot of trouble filling these jobs, and the turnover is particularly high for nurses. We had a nurse who came to Washington last year. She basically came forward as a whistleblower. She was assigned to a facility down in Texas, and she said, the care that I am being asked to provide is subpar. It is contrary to my medical ethics. There were nurses in Arizona who were being forced to administer chest x-rays. They wrote to the state and said, this is a violation of the Nurse Practice Act. I'm going to be disciplined on my license. The state forwarded it to the feds. The feds wrote back and they said, basically, we don't think that nurses employed in federal detention facilities are subject to state licensing requirements. So the nurses are walking off the job, and I can't say as I blame them, but unfortunately the detainees are suffering. I should say that the medical system in detention is run by the Division of Immigration Health Services, is primarily staffed by doctors of the Public Health Service and contract nurses who are hired. And often the facilities have no doctor on site. They may have a medical director who's several states away. A doctor or a nurse who orders a particular test, wants to get diagnostic services, wants to seek specialist care, actually has to send the request to Washington, D.C., where it's reviewed by a team of nurses who don't see the chart, don't see the patient, and are dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of cases. There are 4 nurses on the team. I could go on and on and on, but I think I want to paint a slightly rosier picture towards the end here by saying a couple of words about unaccompanied children. There are a lot of children who come to the United States each year on their own, and they are an extremely traumatized population. We believe that about 80% of girls are actually raped or sexually assaulted on the journey north. To the extent that we know that in Honduras, as families are preparing to send their daughters, they actually are having intrauterine devices implanted in the girls because they expect they're going to be raped. In 2003, responsibility for the care of children was transferred from the Department of Homeland Security to the Department of Health and Human Services. And that was that was a great improvement in the services for children. They live in shelters, they live in foster homes, they have school, they have recreation, they have child welfare staff attending to their needs. But that being said, as we traveled around the country researching our report on unaccompanied children, we talked to a lot of clinical staff who said, we don't feel that we have the skills and expertise necessary to diagnose gender-based violence, rape, sexual assault, mental illness, PTSD in these kids. We found to their credit that the medical staff are in fact identifying these issues in many cases, but what they then said to us was even if we identify them, we just don't have the services available to meet the needs. Most of the kids are held in rural areas, primarily in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. There just aren't a lot of providers in the community. HHS has started to enter into agreements with local service providers to improve mental health care. They've also expanded the level of education that's required for clinical staff. And so I do think that services are going to continue to improve for children, and we hope to see similar improvement in services for parents. But wanting to end with a couple of recommendations, I think that these problems can actually be fixed and fixed quite easily. And I think that it's very, very important that the United States move quickly and effectively to reform the way we treat detainees, because we know that the rest of the world is watching. A reform process began under the new administration last summer. We are hoping that they will soon be employing a risk assessment tool and an assumption of release for every individual. So unless the government can prove that you need to be detained, you would be released, particularly if you have a medical condition, a mental health issue, you're a parent, you're elderly, you're a victim of trafficking. And for people who have to be detained, we hope that they will then be placed in civil facilities that are truly appropriate for the population and specific to the individual needs of particular groups of detainees, for example, chronic medical cases or the mentally ill. We also are quite hopeful that new standards will be issued. The government is working on new standards for care. They were supposed to go into effect this year. Turns out that what the feds didn't understand is that the contracts have to be renegotiated with the facilities before the standards can be implemented. And so I think that the rollout of that is going to be delayed, and they're still based on a correctional model. But I do hope that we're going to see a shift towards standards that are appropriate for a civil administrative population, as well as monitoring by NGOs and other outside experts who are in a much better place to kind of make sure that the right hand and the left hand know what the other is doing and are working in the best interest of the individuals involved. So I guess I will close there, and I'm sure I've left you with a lot of unclear situations here, but I'm happy to discuss a little bit further in Q&A.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be back at the university and talking, though, about a really difficult subject of human trafficking. I mean, all of us on this panel have been talking about emotional, gut-wrenching situations for women and girls throughout the world. Human trafficking comes at the intersection between voluntary and forced migration. A couple of more pieces of data to throw out. There are about 215 million international migrants. There's an estimate from the Human Development Report that there are about 700 million internal migrants. In both cases, the vast majority of those who are moving from rural to urban areas, from areas where there is a high level of human insecurity, either because of economic reasons or because of conflict, or repression, climate change, environmental problems, a slew of reasons that people have difficulty remaining where they are. The majority of the world's migrants who cross international borders are migrating within regions. The discussion of global health issues this morning was very important because that is the context for most of the world's migrants. They are not necessarily all coming to the wealthy northern countries. Many of them are actually migrating from south to south, from one developing country to another. It's also important to keep in mind that half of all migrants, both labor migrants and conflict-induced migrants, are women. For those who get to the north, the numbers are actually a bit higher, about 52% of the migrants in North America, Europe, Australia, other wealthy countries are women, and we're seeing an increasing trend towards the feminization of migration. And as the northern countries age, we'll probably see even a greater trend towards women migrating in order to provide all the caregiving services that the aging population that we again heard about a bit this morning will be requiring. But human trafficking is when all of this goes wrong. And particularly in conflict situations, it goes wrong in a lot of different ways. The faces that I've shown here are just some of the many faces of human trafficking. The women from the Balkans who have been trafficked into prostitution, sexual exploitation, particularly those from Bosnia or Kosovo, which were experiencing conflict. The young children from Burma who have been recruited as child soldiers to exploit their labor. The lower picture that looks like a classroom is a classroom, but it's not just an ordinary classroom. It's actually a group of child soldiers from Colombia who have been released from combat and are now attempting to be reintegrated into their communities. On the lower left, on the other side of that picture, is a young Sri Lankan girl who has also been a child soldier and has been injured during the combat and is now in a hospital obtaining treatment. My first experience with trafficking in conflict situations was in the early 1980s on the Thai-Cambodian border. I had been there on an evaluation for a while, and it became very apparent that there were no adolescents in the camp. The camp was 250,000 people, again, one of these refugee camps that's become a city. And yet there appeared to be no adolescent boys, no adolescent girls. And I started probing as I developed more contacts and more confidence with the local population. It was fairly obvious why the young men were gone, the adolescent boys. They had been recruited by resistance forces who controlled the camp and were back inside Cambodia fighting the Vietnamese who had occupied the country. The situation of the girls was a bit different. One of the women I spoke to said, well, the pretty girls are in Bangkok, that the brothel owners come in every Sunday when the aid agencies are out of the camp, and they recruit the pretty girls into prostitution to work in the brothels. And I said, well, what happens to the not pretty girls who were in the camps? And they said, well, they actually get recruited by the resistance. I said, well, what are they doing with the resistance? And they were providing sexual services, domestic services, but they were also clearing mines. I said, what does that mean? And they said, what it means is that they walk in front of the soldiers, and so they blow up the mines. Now, these are situations that, that meet the definition of human trafficking. When I did this work in the 1980s, we didn't have an international convention or a protocol to fight human trafficking, but there now is one, often called the Palermo Protocol, and there are a number of areas of significance in terms of this definition. First of all, it means some type of mobility, recruitment, transport, transfer of populations. But its particular type, it's by force or by deception. The victims may be perfectly willing to migrate, but they have been deceived in terms of what stands ahead of them and what kind of experience they'll be having. It can be by abuse of power. Unfortunately, too often now we're seeing in humanitarian crises the sexual exploitation of women and girls by the very people who are supposed to be there to assist and protect them, by humanitarian aid workers, by peacekeepers who are there but offering food, protection, shelter in exchange for sexual favors. So that's the third element of the definition. Trafficking is this movement of people by force or deception for the purpose of exploiting their labor. Again, it's not maybe a voluntary decision to move, but generally people aren't volunteering to be exploited in the way in which the traffickers are seeking to exploit them. There are some particularly vulnerable groups to trafficking, particularly in the context of conflict. We see it amongst both those who are in camps, who are in isolated areas that, as I said, function as cities. We've been emphasizing this, but don't generally have some of the hallmarks of an urban area as we think of it. No rule of law, no justice system, no police, no alternative livelihoods within the the camp situation, where people are almost totally dependent on whatever humanitarian aid is offered to them. And clearly, when people are so dependent on aid of others, they become quite vulnerable to being trafficked, because if that aid level goes down at all, and very often it does over time, there's very little to substitute. Offering sex is one of the few things available to women and girls in this situation. But we also see trafficking occurring in urban areas or in places where refugees, displaced persons, conflict affected are spontaneously settled. And again, find it very difficult, or usually living in those areas without formal permission, have very little access to livelihoods, are in hiding, are very unlikely to call upon the protection of the police, even if it were possible to get that protection. And within those settings, not surprisingly, it's women who are heads of households, particularly widows, in the conflict setting where husbands have been killed in the conflict, who are vulnerable. Adolescents across the board are amongst the most vulnerable population that we see in these types of settings. Separated and unaccompanied children, as we just heard about, and also particularly children who, both of whose parents have died, older children who are left to care for younger children and have the full responsibility of the household. We see, as my story from the Thai-Cambodian border illustrated, a lot of different forms of trafficking in conflict-affected areas. Forced labor, Burma is a perfect example of this, where the government impresses people into providing forced labor throughout the country and often in support of military operations, allowing the buildup of a very large military because of the forced labor of the civilian population. Domestic servitude in keeping, cooking, sex favors, etc., for the troops, variety of sexual exploitation and abuse in prostitution, brothels, etc., and various different aspects of combat, from carrying arms to, as I mentioned, clearing mines. So why in conflict settings is there this vulnerability to trafficking? Most conflict settings, we've seen a breakdown in law and order. We also see a tremendous breakdown in family structures. The type of community-based systems of protection for those who are without support otherwise tends to evaporate in the context of conflict. So many women and girls, young men as well, have almost no alternatives facing them. Their social safety net has completely broken down from either the family or the community. Throughout the humanitarian regime, we have major problems of inadequacies in assistance that's offered to those who are victims of conflict. It is not at all surprising to be in a camp where only a third of necessary rations are being provided every month, and where the rations that are provided are very, very basic grains and little in the way of fruits, vegetables, or protein. And this inadequate assistance drives people to find alternative sources. And again, where other types of livelihoods are not, where people can't legally earn money, traffickers are easily able to exploit that situation. Gender discrimination is a major factor in trafficking throughout the world, and where there is little access to employment or education, and again, in many conflict settings, women and girls have much less access to the very limited type of educational opportunities that can be found. And in many conflicts, there grows to be a tolerance of gender-based violence that over time inures people to what's occurring in their own communities, and the kinds of things that we see in trafficking situations become the norm, not the exception, again, leading to much greater vulnerability. Disappointingly, the very things that we have in place to try to end conflict, to provide protection, actually increases the likelihood of trafficking. It doesn't decrease it. There tends to be, whether it's in the Congo or in Bosnia or in any of the other countries that we know about, where there are significant deployment of peacekeeping forces, we also see a tremendous growth in prostitution. And with that growth in prostitution comes trafficking of people, including people directly out of refugee and displaced persons camps into those brothels, as I mentioned in the Thai situation. A lot of military commanders ignore trafficking for the brothels frequented by the soldiers, assuming that this is just what soldiers do and there's not much that can be done about it. The UN has focused on trying to address this problem within the peacekeeping division, but it continues to be endemic. So what are the health issues related more specifically to trafficking? Given that there is such a predominance of trafficking for sexual exploitation, and this doesn't mean necessarily just trafficking for prostitution or brothels. It also means that there's a tremendous amount of sexual abuse of women and girls who were trafficked as soldiers by military or trafficked for forced labor. Rape is a part of those other processes of trafficking. It's not only found in the brothels. With that, of course, comes the transmittal of various infections and sexually transmitted infections and HIV/AIDS. Unwanted pregnancies are another factor, and although there has been progress within the humanitarian field in developing new standards and availability of health, family planning, and post-pregnancy options, that hasn't necessarily carried over very much into the trafficking situation, which is a much more hidden area, and reaching the victims of trafficking is much more difficult. There are horrible stories throughout humanitarian crises, but particularly in the trafficking situation, of damage to reproductive tracts. We've seen in many countries problems with fistula that at a very, very alarming rate. High levels of trauma, both physical and mental trauma, and social exclusion even amongst those who have been trafficked, who are able to get out of that situation and return to their homes, but are isolated because of the very things that happen to them during the course of the trafficking. And then, of course, the landmine and other injuries for those who become involved in the conflict itself. So quickly, what are some of the areas for addressing trafficking? We normally talk about the 3 Ps, that we need a holistic approach that includes prevention, prosecution of the traffickers, and protection of the trafficking victims. Unfortunately, the middle area, prosecution, has tended to get a lot more attention and resources than the prevention or protection. But key to the prevention efforts is providing adequate assistance, protection, and livelihoods for women and children affected by conflict. I'm not getting into what can be done to prevent the conflict, but even assuming within a conflict setting, there are things that can be done to enhance the protection of those who are victimized by conflict. Prosecution, statutes that criminalize human trafficking. It's amazing how many countries do not have such provisions in which the penalties are much greater for trafficking in cigarettes than there are for trafficking in people. And again, we see this throughout the world. need to get an increased recognition that the focus of prosecution should be on the traffickers and not the victims. It's often easier to bust a brothel and prosecute the prostitutes than to get at the networks that have established the prosecution rings. Then protection, we need to be protecting the victims against the traffickers, providing more in the way of reintegration assistance to the victims, and of course ways of providing the reproductive health and psychosocial programs that are absolutely essential for addressing the effects, aftermath of trafficking. And I'll end there.
What we have heard is an extremely vivid set of presentations about all of these issues, starting with Susan Herden's discussion about the complexity of these situations, these complex humanitarian emergencies, some of them driven by natural disasters, as she said, many of them driven by conflict situations, and then, of course, the whole sequelae of health issues that are suffered by the women in particular who are moved from place to place. And she mentioned that vivid example of some refugees moving from low HIV prevalence areas to high HIV prevalence areas, becoming more exposed to HIV. Of course, it happens the other way as well, but very often these movements of populations actually do serve to spread these conditions with them. She talked about her number one solution for this, which I'd like to come back to later, which is educating girls, but we'll return to that in a moment. We heard Emily describe the situation of detention here and how the U.S. unfortunately now is being viewed as the model for other countries to copy, how to do detention and keep people from immigrating because of it. And she mentioned that even, of course, the largest immigration center in the Northeast happens to be right here in New York, Pennsylvania. Obviously, the situations that she described facing the detainees and refugees, very, very severe, very seriousness, whether it's misdiagnosis of their mental illness as psychosis and over-medication that flows from that, women being shackled during labor and delivery. She mentioned the example of nurses being told that state laws don't apply to them if they're working in federal detention centers, et cetera. So a great deal obviously to be dealt with there. And then we heard from Susan Martin about how the trafficking situation that arises as the majority of the world's migrants do migrate within regions. Half of all of those migrants, as she underscored, being women. She talked about the example of being on the Thai-Cambodia border in the 80s and learning that the pretty girls got recruited to go to Bangkok and be in the commercial sex workers, whereas the non-pretty girls got the job of clearing mines ahead of some of the fighters in the region at the time. And she mentioned, of course, the other array of problems, the forced labor, the sex work, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, et cetera. Not to mention the health issues that flow from that, whether it is sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, damage to the reproductive tract in the form of fistula, et cetera. And then she talked about how the unfortunate result of a lot of this is that prosecution gets more attention than prevention of the situation. It's easier to bust, as she said, the brothel in Bangkok than it is to keep these situations from developing in the first place. So with that, I wanted to go back to Susan's prescription, because we have all of these issues. All of you are working very hard to attack them as they manifest themselves. Everybody would agree it'd be a whole lot better to prevent these things from happening in the first place, to have more stable societies so that we don't have armed conflict, so we don't have forced migration, so we don't have all of these horrible things that we described that flow from that. And Susan's prescription was educating girls. So let's start with that, even though that's going to be a topic later today. But let's start with that, and let's move on to some other prescriptions that might flow from that.
And I don't want to steal your thunder from the next panel, but I'll reinforce the message that I expect will come. Susan Martin mentioned the disruption of community. And what we know about, and I want to go back to Dr. Penn's statement about lifespan. So the transition from child to adult includes sexual maturation, includes independence, and includes economic independence as well as a new social role. And in the world, that transition is usually mediated by family and community. And folks who are experiencing displacement or conflict or crisis have that community disrupted. So helping that transition from child to adult in the setting of forced migration is one of the challenges we face. So that's part of the reason for focusing on keeping adolescent girls in school. Another part of it goes back to the objective of the NIH Center on Research in Women and Women in the Sciences. So all of us finished primary education, high school, college, and it's only because of that that we're able to contribute. And the whole world needs the contribution of all those women, all those girls who are potential parts of the solution, the prevention of conflict, the prevention of trafficking, the support for breastfeeding, all the things that we want in progress in the world and in women's health are predicated on the ability of girls to get an education. And the reason we want to focus on adolescent girls is because one of the impediments to girls achieving that level of education is the process of development, the passage through puberty, menstruation. You'll hear in this next panel. It's just really important. So all of us, I think it was Dr. Gutman on the first day who said we have to work collectively. It was Sheila Patel yesterday who said we have to take a long-term approach. It's not a quick fix. But if the world's going to be a better place in the future, girls have to finish their education.
Emily, what is the situation for education of the detainees? Can children who are in detention go to school?
Yes, yes, they can. I'm not sure if I'm picking up. They can. For children who are in the custody of Department of Health and Human Services, education is provided in the shelters, or if they're living with the foster family, then they attend school in the local community. But I will say that we have run into significant problems with education around family detention. It's much better, actually, at the facility here in Pennsylvania. It's run through the intermediate units in Pennsylvania, who have a very, very strong in-facility program. But when I first went to the Hutto facility, which was the larger family facility down in Texas, I asked to observe some classes. Children were getting 1 hour of education a day. And so I sat in on a class, and it was 13 and 14-year-old boys and girls, and the topic of conversation was basically babysitting skills, how to diaper a baby, how to quiet a crying child. And so these children were falling very, very far behind on their educational development, and if they did win their case, then there was very little opportunity for them to catch up with schooling in the community post-release, particularly considering that so many of them were limited English proficient.
Susan, what do you see as the ultimate preventative to trafficking?
Well, I agree with Susan very much that getting adolescents education is very important. It's a key ingredient. But it's necessary but not sufficient, because if there are no livelihoods after that, there's no way to take that education and actually apply it, then it actually can create even further problems in building up expectations without opportunities thereafter. So I think we have to really think very carefully about what the transition is, as Susan was saying, from adolescence into adulthood, and where we're heading in terms of gender equality, opportunities, et cetera, because that, to me, is the key issue in terms of reducing, at least on the supply side. There's a lot that can be done with trafficking in terms of focusing on the demand side. If there weren't a demand for commercial sex workers, for child soldiers, etc., then trafficking would not be as financially lucrative an occupation as it is, and now it is extremely lucrative financially.
Let's go to some questions from the audience. There's a question first for Susan Purdon from Sharon Ballin of the Renfield Foundation. We've adopted a Rwandan genocide survivor who was 4 years old at the time of the genocide. His mother survived but died a few years later of cancer. Have any studies been done of the long-term health effects of this kind of stressor, genocide, that do not immediately appear?
That's a question I don't have an answer to. I don't know.
There have been some studies of refugees resettled in the United States, and actually the studies of Cambodians who were resettled would mirror most closely what would have happened with the Rwandans. Some of the findings, it showed extremely high levels, as mentioned before, of post-traumatic stress as a result of the events, and again, not surprisingly. Some of the studies of resettled populations show that there is a lag time. It's actually after they've been here for 18 months or longer that some of the most troubling symptoms start to come out, that they're dealing with survival up until that point. But once they've adjusted somewhat and life has gotten a little bit more normal, then the effects of the trauma really become very, very evident. A colleague of mine who's done quite a lot of work in this area, though, is very cautious about over-medicalizing the after effects of trauma because it is such a commonly experienced issue that very often what really characterizes refugees, displaced persons, is their resilience. And figuring out ways to support that resilience may actually be a more effective way of helping them move past the traumas that they've experienced.
Susan Martin, a question for you. How do we identify and recognize trafficking if it is going on before our eyes, and what can one individual do about it?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. There have been some concerted efforts within the United States to educate effectively the first responders who are most likely to come into contact with people who have been trafficked, the local police, immigration authorities. One of the problems with the whole detention issue is that amongst those who are detained are people who've been trafficked, but because they are in the process of being trafficked. And it's very important that immigration officials identify who amongst these are just coming in seeking work and who have been forced into the situation they're in. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. Primary health givers, emergency room staff, judges who are in courts that hear a lot of prostitution cases. Those types of people where the education in terms of some of the warning signs. There's one case in Newark, New Jersey, for example, in which a judge was just just thought that some of the young women who had been picked up in one of the raids on a brothel looked awfully young. And the lawyer kept saying, no, 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 they're all over 21, and just find them and let them go. And the judge finally pressed him and said, who's paying your salary and your fees? And the lawyer wouldn't respond. And so the judge basically fired him, got pro bono counsel for the women, and discovered that half of them were under 18 on that. But that's the kind of education that needs to take place. Look deeper into these situations because it could be a trafficking case. And that's what all of us as individuals can be doing, and to just be vigilant to the fact that trafficking is all around us.
Emily, a question for you from Marjorie Maida from here at the School of Nursing in the global health arena. Has the treatment of women asylum seekers who are detained in the U.S. changed since the change of administrations last year?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I would say not yet, but I'm more optimistic than I was a year ago. As I mentioned in my remarks, the administration began a process last summer to create what they're calling a civil detention model. And so we hope that part and parcel of that model will be a recognition that these people are not inmates, and that the services need to be reflective of the administrative nature of their presence in a facility, and also of the specialized needs that tend to manifest themselves, particularly with the asylum-seeking population. I also hope that with the development of a risk assessment tool, that asylum seekers will be quickly released if they are detained at all, which obviously would make access to services much simpler for many people. We also do know that in the new performance-based detention standards, that there is a standard that's particularly related to the needs of women, as well as new standards on prison rape elimination. Unfortunately, we have seen some changes happening in the system as a result of these new standards, but they seem to be thus far window dressing. Signs about what to do if you have been a victim of sexual assaults, cameras in the facilities, but we don't necessarily see the follow-through of what would happen if somebody does file a complaint or a grievance or an incident occurs in a facility. And so I'm anxious to see over the next year or two, as the administration's reforms go further and further, whether we are in a much different place than we're in today.
Susan, a question came in about educating girls about anticipating rapes and sexual abuse and giving them condoms. And actually, I'd love to hear you address that in the ethnic and cultural and religious contexts in which so much of this education would have to occur with respect to refugees and displaced persons. How easy or hard is it to introduce those topics?
What a world we live in. Well, let me start with a story. I've worked on reproductive health in refugee settings for a long time, and one of the things we've introduced is condoms, freely accessible and widely distributed in the acute phase, because people do have sex and need the opportunity to be protected if they want to avoid pregnancy or STIs. And we've also distributed female condoms, and the place where we had the greatest uptake of female condoms was in the refugee camps in Western Tanzania. And so I said, okay, what's going on? Well, it turns out that the women who were going to repatriate anticipated being raped and inserted a female condom for their journey home. What a world we live in. So women are smart, and they will do what they can to protect themselves. Talking about reproductive health is political. It has opponents because of perceptions of that if you talk about it, people will do it more. I don't buy it. You know, people do it. So addressing the concerns that people have from religious aspects has to do with having conversations with people, just like anything else. I was working with Southern Sudan. There weren't refugees. It was during the time of the Southern Sudan Civil War, and I was talking about reproductive health. It was an amazing event. We had a training under a tree, and we were translating in 3 languages. But I had a session with religious leaders and community leaders, and we talked about the opportunity for people to be healthier if they took some steps to protect themselves from STIs or unwanted pregnancy. And I had condoms, and I always do a little demo with condoms, you know, put it on your hand and stuff, because people don't, there's this myth about condoms, there's a whole thing about sex. But at the end of the talk, this preacher took a condom out of his shirt pocket, and he said, I'm going to talk about this at church on Sunday. So people are reasonable, and people do want to be healthy. It's a matter of, sometimes it's our own comfort level talking about sex. How did I get to sex?
Because I asked you.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, there is reticence, but what I've discovered is that people are shy to talk about sex because they were taught to be shy to talk about sex. But if you give them permission, if you're comfortable, they really want to talk about it. And they want to learn, and they want to understand, and it just works. It's not that hard, I think.
As we edge our way to closing, I've saved a couple of the really explosive questions for the end. Here's another one. I notice there's no mention of abortion, access to methods of treating complications of unsafe elective abortion. Can we talk about this to provide a complete representation of all the reproductive health needs of migrants, forced migrants, those forced into trafficking situations, et cetera? Susan Martin, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I think the abortion issue has been as highly politicized in the humanitarian context over the years as it has been more generally. During the Bush administration, the Mexico City policy with regard to not counseling on abortion was applied for the first time to organizations that were working with refugees and in conflict settings. That's since been reversed. But I think clearly that is a part of the whole complex of issues that need to be discussed within the context of unwanted pregnancies, whether it's rape during conflict, problems, sexual abuse in detention centers, and certainly trafficking. But it is a very difficult issue to raise in many contexts. And there are a lot of faith-based organizations, including Catholic organizations, that are very dominant healthcare providers in refugee and humanitarian settings. And this, of course, is off the table as far as they're concerned. But Susan probably has.
Yes, all that is true. And there are as well the agencies who are supportive of access to safe abortion services and making abortion available within the legal constructs of the countries we're working in and how to do that. So MVA for manual vacuum aspiration, medical abortion, what are the laws in the country and what is permissible and how to make that available to people. So globally, there's an interagency working group on reproductive health in conflict situations, which has produced a guideline, a manual, and there's a current revision of that manual coming out this year, which includes a chapter on abortion and post-abortion care. And so one of the things we do is to educate the people who are working on the ground of what the laws are in that country so that whatever is legal can be made available to people. We don't require agencies that have a restriction on their personnel from performing the service, but we do expect people to make women who need access aware of what their legal rights are in a setting.
We are nearing the time to close, and I know people by this point probably want to get to lunch, so we will be expeditious in closing here. There were a number of questions we could not get to, some of them quite detailed pertaining to asylum issues. I believe the three panels will be up here for a few minutes afterwards, so please come up if you do have an additional question and ask it of them then. But our final question is going to be, we know there's a person down at Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. who cares a lot about these issues. Her name is Secretary Hillary Clinton. If she were here and you were giving her advice about your particular issues, Susan Martin, you about global trafficking, you, Emily, about detention and asylees, you, Susan Purdon, about virtually everything, but especially the issues with respect to refugees and displaced persons and the issues affecting women in particular and their health. If you had 30 seconds with the secretary, what would you say to her, the most urgent thing she's got to take up? Susan Martin, we'll start with you.
I think on trafficking, I would first say the U.S. is a leader in this area and should continue to be a leader. We need to take a more holistic approach to combating trafficking, focus much more on prevention and protection than is currently the case. And the U.S. should be a leader not only by preaching, but by making sure that our own policies and our own programs are at the highest level.
Susan Burden?
I would ask her to put the resources behind the rhetoric. She knows what needs to be done. She said it herself. She's got Ambassador Revere. She's got the Global Health Initiative. We should be the leader in supporting and financing and making the programs available globally. Scale up everything.
And Emily.
Well, and of course, issues of immigration detention don't follow under the jurisdiction of the Department of State, but we know that Secretary Clinton is a staunch advocate for the rights of women, and we also know that there's been a commitment on the part of this administration through the White House Council on Women and Girls to really improve treatment across all of the agencies of women and girls that we serve here in the U.S. and of how we represent needs of women and girls in foreign policy. And so I would urge the Secretary to bring her colleagues, other cabinet-level officials, agencies in the government with her, and to serve as a leader for the behaviors that we want to model in our domestic policy and in our foreign relations.
And we were asked to close with the one actionable item for all of us, and I guess what you would all agree would be is basically to support all of those things happening, whether it's writing your legislator, writing Secretary Clinton, or carrying them out in your own lives to the extent that you can. Join me in thanking this panel for a terrific discussion.